This is Radio Free Wall Street with Lee Adler, on the web at radiofreewallstreet.fm and wallstreetexaminer.com. Hello, I'm Lee Adler. Last week on Radio Free Wall Street, I did a segment on how the U.S. government has systematically and deliberately understated inflation since 1983. What I found absolutely blew my mind. Just ahead is that segment. Also on that video, I discussed the forces that drive the market. If you'd like to see the entire video, you can by going to radiofreewallstreet.fm, where you can subscribe. Now here's that segment on how the government understates inflation. Let's talk about inflation again. I've made a point recently of pointing out that the Fed, in terms of how it measures inflation, is going to be way behind the curve in finally recognizing that we do have inflation. There's two reasons for that. First of all, the economic definition of inflation includes only the prices of items that are consumed. When economists talk about the general price level, they're only talking about consumption items. They're not talking about asset prices. So asset inflation is immediately excluded from the definition of inflation. If asset prices are inflating, that doesn't matter as long as consumer prices are stable. The second thing is that the way the government measures consumer prices doesn't even accurately reflect consumer prices. That's because it doesn't count housing accurately. I was doing some research on this week, and I came across this piece from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. This is titled, How the CPI Measures Price Change of Owner's Equivalent Rent of Primary Residence. That's how they measure the housing component of the CPI. They call it owner's equivalent rent. And it's based on a rental survey of not only owners, they ask owners what their opinion of the rent of their house is, but they also survey renters in a given market, and they ask them how much they're paying in rent. They avoid the cost of housing altogether under this rationale. I'm going to read this to you verbatim. Shelter, the service that housing units provide their occupants, is a major part of the CPI market basket, the goods and services that people need for day-to-day living. Two CPI indexes, owner's equivalent rent of primary residence and rent of primary residence, measure the change in the shelter costs consumers receive from their primary residences. And here comes the important part. Housing units are not in the CPI market basket. Like most other economic series, the CPI views housing units as capital or investment and not as consumption items. Spending to purchase and improve houses and other housing units is investment, not consumption. Therefore, we can ignore it. It's not inflation because it doesn't count as consumption. Shelter, the service the housing units provide, is the relevant consumption item for the CPI. The cost of shelter for renter-occupied housing is rent. For an owner-occupied unit, the cost of shelter is the implicit rent that owner-occupants would have to pay if they were renting their homes. I discovered that prior to 1983, the Bureau of Labor Statistics did count housing prices, actual housing prices in the CPI. This was a huge problem for them in the 1970s because house prices were going wild in the mid to late 1970s. And as house prices inflated, the CPI was moving up and up and up. It went into the teens at one point. I think it hit a high of maybe 16% in the early 1980s. And of course, this was a huge problem for the U.S. government because all government benefits are indexed to the CPI. So what the government did at that point was to define housing out of inflation completely and only count owner's equivalent rent based on a survey of renters and owners. Now, that's all well and good if you're actually measuring market rent, which to a great extent does reflect inflation. Every time a property is put up for rent on the market, we see the trends go up and down. As a commercial real estate appraiser for 15 years, part of my job was estimating market rent. And federal law required that market rent was the amount of rent agreed to between a renter and a landlord at that given point in time, assuming no undue influence on either side. So it was a meeting of the minds at that point in time, market rent, okay? So you would think that CPI would include at least market rent, but that's not it. It doesn't include market rent at all. What it includes is the rent that you're paying right now. Now, you may have signed your lease 2, 5, 10, 20 years ago. Some people have lived in their New York apartments all their lives under rent control. So what the CPI measures is the amount of rent you're paying, not the market rent, not what it would cost you to go into the market and rent an equivalent unit, but what you are paying right now. So if you signed a lease 5 years ago with 2% increases built into that lease agreement, that's how the government estimates the rental component of CPI. And that component accounts for 30% of total CPI. Owner's equivalent rent is 30% of total CPI. Now I'm going to show you a chart that compares the level of market rents in the United States, median market rent versus owner's equivalent rent, just to illustrate how egregious the understatement of CPI is based on this one factor alone. This is a chart of U.S. median market rent versus owner's equivalent rent. 4 times a year, the Census Bureau surveys the rental market across the United States to get an estimate of market rent for various communities, regions, states, and for the nation as a whole. However, this figure for market rent is not the figure that's used by the Bureau of Labor Statistics in calculating the Consumer Price Index. As we've discussed, they use owner's equivalent rent. So I've shown on this chart, going back to 1988, the median asking rent up here and the owner's equivalent rent here. And what I want to show you is that over long periods of time, when inflation is raging, the owner's equivalent rent component is going to grossly understate the actual rental increases across the United States. From 1988 to 2006, market rent rose by 112%. Owner's equivalent rent over the same period rose by only 88%. That 24% difference over an 18-year period saved the U.S. government billions and billions and billions in CPI adjustments to Social Security, government pensions, civil service paychecks, ad infinitum. So basically, it was a fraud on the American people. Next, let's look at the period from 2011 to 2014. Market rents rose by 12.1% over this period. Owner's equivalent rent rose by only 4.7%. Keep in mind that owner's equivalent rent represents 30% of CPI. So we have an understatement of nearly 60% for 30% of the CPI. Instead of the current 2% readings, we're probably somewhere in the 3 to 4% range in terms of actual CPI inflation. Not to mention actual asset inflation, which probably adds another 1 or 2% to that. Finally, at the bottom of the chart, I show the annual rate of increase in red on the market rent, and then in gold on the owner's equivalent rent. Over the last year, ending in the first quarter, market rent rose by 6.7% and owner's equivalent rent rose by 2.6%. So again, there's an egregious understatement, underweighting of real rental rate inflation in the CPI based on this manipulation of the numbers. And finally, the Fed doesn't even use CPI. So the American people are getting ripped off because their increases in CPI, the component of Social Security and various other benefits, are far below what the actual cost increases are. But not only that, the Fed relies on the PCE deflator, which uses even a lesser weighting of housing than does CPI. So the Fed is even further, not only behind the curve, the Fed doesn't even see the curve. Inflation has already accelerated. Here's a plateau in market rent. As a chartist, you'll recognize this as a trading range. Well, rents broke out of that range at the beginning of 2013, and they've been accelerating ever since then. So we're already on our way in terms of rental rates, and these will begin to be reflected eventually. There will be some catch up in this level, but it'll never get to 6.7%. It might get to 3.5% as this continues to increase. Rental rates will continue to be understated as a component of CPI, and that means that inflation will not be recognized until it's far, far too late. So that's the story. In the rest of this video, I talked about the subject of peak financial engineering, the bubble that's currently in effect in our markets in the U.S. And I looked at real-time federal tax data that suggests that, yes, we are at the peak of this bubble, or very close to it. If you'd like to see the rest of the video and my regular commentaries on a weekly basis, just go to radiofreewallstreet.fm and subscribe. Thanks for watching. This has been Radio Free Wall Street with Lee Adler. Find this program on the web at radiofreewallstreet.fm or wallstreetexaminer.com.